And hello once again, my name is Lupus, and today I'm going to be talking about speech act theory, which I know is just an extremely fun topic. So, before I do that though, let me just say that if you appreciate these videos that I do, and I've done too many of them, and you want to support me, you can check out my books or my Patreon, both of which are in the description, but I'm going to move on from that from now to talk about speech act theory. So, speech act theory, what is it? Now, first to say that, before we actually say what is a speech act, is that speech act theory was a part of sort of the performative turn, as they call it, which is a new way of understanding performativity in the world. So it essentially is how the performative utterance, saying something, can lead to an action, right? So the idea that essentially performed acts, things that you do, can lead to certain actions in the world that have an impact in some way. That's being very, very broad. Speech act theory is more specific than that, but just as a broad overview of the performative turn. So, essentially, first, what is an utterance? Because speech acts are made up of utterances. It's a speech act. It's a thing that is said. So, an utterance is made up of two basic things: the content of the utterance, what is it about, what did you actually say, and the purpose of making the utterance in the first place. So, what was said, and why was it said? Okay, so what is a speech act? A speech act, very broadly, is a thing that is said. So it's an act. It's a speech. It's a part of speech that then leads to an action. Literally, words that make thing happen. Speech act. It's very, very simple. It's like one of the most self-explanatory types of sort of linguistic theories that you get. So basically, a speech act is a kind of speech that leads to an action of some kind. So the examples they like to give, well, here I'm just going to say speech act theory encompasses human rights, law, injurious speech, and gender ascriptions. So think about when it comes to the example they love to give is the guy who officiates a wedding, right? So the guy who the priest or whoever it happens to be, it doesn't have to be a priest, but you know, in sort of more traditional weddings, it's a priest, is the person who says, you know, I now declare you man and wife, or I now declare you man and man, or, you know, wife and wife, whatever. I now declare you that thing. That is a declarative act. It is right? He's saying things, but by saying the thing, this person who is making the people married is also performing an act. Things are said which leads to it being real, right? And when it comes to human rights, when human rights are stated, right, by the body that produces them, so a government, when a government says a thing is, it then becomes an act. It becomes real, right? When you say that, like, you know, police will arrest you if you do this thing, a law, you break a law, the police will arrest you. If a person says that, then it becomes an act. It becomes a physical, tangible thing that can happen. Now, when it comes to things like injurious speech and gender ascriptions, I'm going to be getting into that in the next video, because the next video is kind of a companion piece to this one, which is about speech act theory in practice, like actual physical things it can do. But today we're talking about more the actual specifics of what a speech act is. Okay, so what are the aspects of a speech act? They are locutionary acts, illocutionary acts, and perlocutionary acts. Fun. Basically, it's like sort of parts of a speech act, but also some people seem to define it as like separate acts, which I also just say I don't really understand it from that perspective, but the way I've mostly seen it as being sort of part of a speech act. The locutionary act is the thing that is said. The illocutionary act is what was done as a result of it, and then basically the perlocutionary act is basically what happened as a result of the illocutionary act taking place. So, right, I tell you, I order you, as say a teacher, like teachers enact speech acts all the time. So a teacher will, for instance, say silence. Okay. So basically, I said, everyone be quiet. That is the speech act. Teacher says, everyone must be quiet. Then what was done, everyone now becomes quiet. That's the illocutionary act. And then the perlocutionary act is that now, as a result of that, we have silence, right? Silence was demanded. People conformed to that and became silent. And so now there is silence. There we go. That's sort of how to see it. That it is what is said, what is done, and then what happens as a result of it. Very fun. Okay, so then what are some types of speech acts? Now, there are two major thinkers who sort of originated a lot of the speech act theory stuff, but a lot of people have worked on it since. People like to say Judith Butler has a lot of speech act theory stuff, but I'm not going to talk about her, them, sorry. But I'm going to talk about Austin and Cyril. I don't actually know how to say if it's Cyril or Cyril or whatever, doesn't matter. So basically, in terms of the types of speech for them, they were both major theorists in the early days of speech act theory, but they kind of came to their ideas in slightly different ways. They're still similar, but not entirely. So types of speech, according to Austin, things like verdictives, exercitatives, commissives, habitatives, and expositives. Okay, basically, and I might have mispronounced some of those words. Doesn't matter. So, essentially, a verdictive is something that involves a verdict. It involves a judgment call of some kind. When you say something through a judgment call, when you say something is bad, it is therefore bad in the sense of that is how it's not perceived. An exercitive, that's the one that makes me mostly confused by how to say it, is an exercise of power, right? When you, for instance, the thing with a teacher, I'm exercising my power by telling everyone to be quiet. And then everyone becomes quiet, I'm exercising power. Okay, permissives involving some kind of commitment, right? So that would be me saying, I promise that I'm going to do whatever. I promise I'll water your plants while you're away, right? I'm committing to something, a commissive, I'm committing. So it is involving commitment. So you see, by saying the thing, I'm going to keep reinforcing this to sort of show, right? By saying I promise, I am not only saying something, I'm also committing to an act of some kind. See, so that's why it's a speech act. Habitatives, however you say that word as well, that involves sort of social attitudes. This person's my friend, which then makes it so. Expositives involving explanations. By explaining something, you're essentially bringing it into being in terms of the understanding of it. Now, types of speech acts, according to Cyril, are assertives, directives, commissives. See, it's also commissives are the same as both of them. Expressives and declaratives. These, I think, are much more straightforward. So, an assertive is something that asserts something. I hate that movie. I'm asserting something. There we go. Directives, I'm directing something to be done, which could be seen as similar to an exercitive from Austin's stuff, right? Is that it's sort of saying, I'm going to direct you to do something. Commissive, or commissives, it's the same as the other one, where it's to commit something, right? So, I promise. That becomes a speech act then. Expressives, to express something. Express a thought, express an opinion, whatever. Declaratives is to declare something. I am now going to go to the toilet. And then afterwards I go to the toilet. So I'm declaring something. Just use a very silly example. So then, basically, other thinkers who came later, people like Judith Butler, their work is much more in the realm of gender performance, which is its own whole thing, which maybe one day I'll talk about it. I probably will make a video talking about gender performance, but not in this format, right? I'm a big fan of Judith Butler's work. But yeah, so basically, these are also in Cyril as sort of basic understandings. Now, the next little thing is that when it comes to speech act, we've just been talking about how speech acts are essentially things determined through language. However, is it only restricted to certain aspects of speech, right? Is it only when I say, I promise to do something? Is that only when it's a speech act? Is it only when I say, I now declare you man and wife? Is that when it's now a speech act? Or is actually kind of all language a speech act? Because all language is actually effecting a physical change on the world. All of it. Because by saying something, you are also bringing thought into being, right? By writing it down, you are bringing thought into being as well. Because thought is intangible. All thought. Even just your random personal thoughts. They're intangible. You can't touch them, right? You can't touch your thoughts. But when you speak, you do bring them into being through an act. However, the reason that this is a bit of a silly path to go down is that you can kind of do this with, like most sort of theories and ideas. If you just keep taking it further and further and further, it can kind of become nonsensical, which is why it can be helpful to have sort of a specific classification, or sort of saying, this is what a speech act is. Yes, regular language does enact an act of some sort on the world, but that can be a little bit difficult and regressive to actually sort of continue to apply. So it sort of loses its helpfulness when you apply it to everything. So, yeah. Now, another little point here to keep in mind when it comes to speech acts, and actually something I didn't write down here, which I also just want to say, is sort of related to the previous point, is that when it comes to, say, the work of people like Judith Butler, they moved also toward things like bodily acts, which are not based on linguistics. So bodily acts when it comes to things like gender presentation, right? When Judith Butler talks about that, it's other things that are not actually language-based, which can ascribe certain things through, like, say, gender presentation. So if you wear certain things, you are presenting as a certain gender, you're performing as a certain gender, which means that it is a speech act. Well, it's kind of goes under speech act theory, because by doing a thing, you're putting it into being in the world. It is a performative act. But even though it's kind of based on speech act theory, it can be a problem to still call it speech acts, because it's not speech anymore, right? It's now gone beyond linguistics. It's gone beyond language. It's actually bodily acts, but it is still heavily influenced by speech act theory in general. But yeah, I'll also talk about that a bit more in the next video, which goes into, more of speech act theory in practice. Now, the next little thing to say here that is very important to note when it comes to speech act theory is that speech acts, right, are not actually based on truth. It doesn't have to be truthful. So it's not about if it's correct, it's about if it's accepted. Okay, so think about an authority figure. An authority figure, what they say is taken to be correct, even if it is not actually correct. Think about, say, a cop, right? A cop tells you to do something, even though you have not committed any kind of a crime. So say a cop orders you to put your hands behind your arms, behind your back, your hands behind your arms, put your hands behind your back because now they're going to cuff you. You didn't do anything wrong at all, but they can make it a kind of truth. They can make it accepted, even if it isn't true. They can arrest you because they have the power to do so. So when they order you to, if they say, put your hands behind your back, you're going to be arrested, that might not be like a truth. It might not be true as in that they should be allowed to do that, but they can, and it is accepted by society. So basically, it is not about truth. It's about just whether it's accepted. So if a speech act is accepted, it's known as a felicitous, I think that's how you say that word. It's a felicitous speech act, and if it is not accepted, it's an infelicitous speech act. So if it is accepted, cool. If it's not accepted, the other, right? So that's how you can differentiate between those two types of things of whether it is or is not accepted. But remember, whether it is or is not accepted is not about truth. It's not about whether it's correct. It's just about whether or not it is accepted. Completely different, right? You can accept falsehoods. We do it all the time. So yeah, that's pretty much it. But the last little thing I'm just going to put here is that there are problems when it comes to the definition of performance and performativity. Because a lot of the time when we're talking about this sort of stuff, we call it performativity. Speech acts are performativity. It's performative acts, which is different from a performance act, which is also different from a performance. Which then becomes very irritating, obviously, because when you think of a performance, you are probably thinking of, right? You're probably thinking there a play, watching a musician make their music. You're at a concert. That is a performance. That is a performance. But when we say the word performance or performative, we're not talking about that. We're also talking about a speech act. Where it gets really annoying. And that's why some people actually prefer things like, say, when it comes to Judith Butler's ideas of bodily acts, right? And sort of saying that they should not call that performatives, it should be called performances. But that is a whole, basically, linguistic argument. It's a whole semantic debate. So it's not something we're going to go into now, because a semantic debate is its own thing, sort of arguing about which words should be used for what. That's a whole other thing. We're not going to get into that now. That's, but it is just to keep it in mind. It's important to keep that in mind, because if you use, especially say if you're writing an essay and you say performative, but you're talking about bodily acts, depending on who's marking your essay, that might or might not be accepted. So that is just something to keep in mind, that some agree with the way that people like Judith Butler have extended the speech act theory into non-linguistic acts, and some people do not agree with that. So just remember that. So yeah, that is speech act theory, or at least a little bit of a basic understanding of speech act theory. The next video is going to be, or the next academic video is going to be a discussion of speech act theory in practice, talking about some actual use cases of speech act theory. This is more, so also basically, if you want to properly understand that, you need to watch this video first. And yeah, so that is it. Hopefully this was helpful, beneficial, and all those other words. If it was, and you want to support me, if you want to, you don't have to, because I've made a lot of these videos, and hopefully they've helped some people. So if you do want to support the kind of work that I do, you can read some of my books. They'll be in the description, or you can support me on Patreon. Or those would be very, very lovely things. I would be most appreciative. But if you can't or don't want to do those things, you can also do the usuals, likes, comments, subscribes, things. So yeah. Otherwise, I hope that you have a great day, week, and month ahead. Goodbye. And remember to keep your speech acts in mind.